Hello everyone, my name is Ben and I teach people the anatomy of lifting so that you can make better gains in the gym. Today we're specifically going to go over the anatomy, the function, and how to train all of the different portions of the pecs, otherwise known as the pec major or the chest. So firstly, we're going to talk about the anatomy, the muscle architecture of the pec, and specifically how different portions of the pec are different from one another. Next, we're going to talk about the physics of their contraction, meaning on a real skeleton model, how they actually stretch and contract. And then lastly, we're going to apply this information, both the anatomy and the physics, to real training settings so that you can know exactly how to train each of your pecs regardless of the context that you're training in. So there are three major portions of the pec. The first is the upper portion of the pec, which attaches from the clavicle down to the upper arm, and it sits, not so coincidentally, on the uppermost portion of the muscle. Then we have the middle pec, which is commonly referred to as the inner pec, and the inner pec attaches to the entire body of the sternum, right? So this whole long bone here, and it spans out roughly to a similar insertion site as the upper pec. And then lastly, we have the lower pec, which again, per its name, is exactly where it sounds like it is, which is on the most lower portion of the muscle, and it attaches basically to most of the ribs, but also a lot of connective tissue, and it actually connects directly with the upper portions of the abs. And it, like the other pecs, converges into this common tendon, which is on the upper arm. Now, one of the things that you can't see from this angle, which I'm going to sort of detail out in just a second here, is the fact that the insertion sites, meaning the attachment sites on this side of the muscle, are all similar but slightly different in accordance with the muscle's function. So if I turn this image and I look at it from this perspective, what you can see is that as the upper pec fibers come down, they actually insert into the upper arm at the lowest portion of the arm. If we look at the middle pecs, they actually sort of twist weirdly underneath and they attach directly in the middle of this insertion site. And then the lower pecs, opposite to the upper pecs, run from low all the way to high. So if you were to take this muscle out of the body and you were looking at it from a flat perspective, and then you took, instead of taking all the broad attachment sites, you just took the insertion and you sort of twisted it and then you put it on the arm, that's sort of what this thing looks like. And that's actually specifically what creates the appearance of this like weird bulging thing on the outermost portion of the pec when people really flex their pecs. And so that's something that's cool to consider because it actually does influence the muscle architecture. Again, in the lower pecs, they run from low to high, and the upper pecs, they run from high to low, and the middle pecs, they run from somewhere in the middle to the middle of that attachment site. Now, in addition to these different fiber orientations and these differences in muscle architecture, they are slightly innervated differently depending on which portion of the pectoral nerves innervates which portion of the pecs. So on the right side of the screen here, again, I've just designated upper, middle, and lower portions, which per their anatomy can also be referred to as the clavicular portion, i.e. the upper portion which attaches to the clavicle, the sternal portion which attaches to the sternum, and then the costal portion which attaches to the costal ribs and the costal cartilages. Now, again, this whole nerve thing actually dictates that each of these pecs will contract together when any of them contracts, but because of the different branches, you can see sort of these green guys branching down here and these yellow guys which branch a little bit higher, their contraction and their innervation can slightly differ depending on the motion that we're doing. So now let's talk specifically more about how we can practically designate these things in a training context. So I like to designate these things, just this is my personal belief in terms of what makes the most amount of sense, into the upper halves of the pecs and the lower half of the pecs. And that's really how we're going to subdivide them when we look at the training application stuff. Now, again, all the portions of the pec will contribute very similarly in some instances, but in other instances, when we get to the nuanced anatomy section of this video, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can really specifically target one portion over the other, because that is something that when we manipulate the physics appropriately, we can do with a high degree of precision and effectiveness. Now, let's transition to the skeleton model and go over the very basics that we just went over, but on a real model where we can actually visualize the different kinds of motion that the different pecs can create.
So just to orient ourselves, the blue rubber bands here represent the upper pecs. They attach again from the clavicle to the upper arm. The red stuff indicates the middle pecs, the inner pecs, which attach from the sternum all along the body of it, also to the upper arm. And then the lower pecs attach somewhere sort of toward the bottom of the sternum and these costal ribs here, and they run more high to low. These are the yellow guys. So the upper pecs, when we're talking about lengthening and shortening them the most in any kind of motion, what we're really talking about is putting the arm in a position where these guys are parallel to the upper arm and where we can take it from a full stretch somewhere a little bit higher up to a full contraction somewhere around the body. And what you just need to remember simply about the upper pecs is they pull from this point to this point together. And that's all they do, right? So if you took your fingers here and you put one here and you just brought the fingers together, the upper pecs would sort of pull the arm, somewhere up in front of the body here. The middle pecs apply the same principles. They bring the arm basically from somewhere out here all the way to the middle of the sternum. So instead of being, something where they're pulling a little bit higher up like this, they're pulling a little bit lower, kind of towards exactly where their origins are. If you're striking the middle ground of all these, you'd pick somewhere in the middle of the sternum and bring the arm over that way. And then the lower pecs apply the same exact principles. You take the arm from a position that's a little bit sort of higher up and backward, because that's as far as they can stretch, or if they don't stretch all the way up and back here, and they would contract all the way down sort of a little bit lower on the body, right? So this is your typical dip type motion. This is your typical sort of mid incline flat press type motion. And this may be a slight incline press upward that way. So again, all these fiber directions, very simple to understand at a sort of two-dimensional level. But as we start to get more advanced and we start to talk about how these stretch differently and contract differently, will be a little bit more nuanced in terms of applying information about the functional anatomy into actually lifting scenarios.
So now that we've covered the basic anatomy of these things, let's start to jump into training, and more specifically how we can manipulate the physics of any exercise to target the pecs more specifically. So the first thing that we need to remember when we're talking about pec training, and this may be very obvious to some of you, is that the resistance that we're using, whether it's a dumbbell, a barbell, a cable, or a machine, needs to be shoving our arms backward behind our body in some kind of direction. That's a given, and that's really what differentiates a press from a pull, right? It's the direction of resistance. So number one, we need some kind of resistance that is pushing our arm backward or downward or upward, and a combination of those things is going to determine the pec recruitment that we get. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced, but changing the way that your arm is oriented relative to your body will also change the recruitment, and we have to consider what the resistance direction is doing in relationship to our arm path. So now let's talk about specifically the differences between something like a wider press and a narrower press, because many of you know intuitively that these two things don't feel the same, and that's for a very specific reason, which is the interaction, and what determines this is the interaction between the load and the arm, and specifically where the upper arm is moving in relationship to the load. So now let's look back at the model and let's dive a little bit deeper into how the upper portions of the pecs can contract differently and more specifically than the lower portions of the pecs.
Now, in the first section on the functional anatomy, we just talked about how the differences in fiber direction affect where the arm ends up. But we only looked at it from one perspective, which was this perspective right here. What we didn't do is we didn't sort of turn to the side and start to ask ourselves, okay, what are the more nuanced things about these tissues that we can understand, and how differently can we target them per their different fiber directions and attachment sites? So the first thing to remember about the upper pecs is that the upper pecs, unlike these other two guys, only attach to the shoulder girdle. They only attach to the clavicle, which what that essentially means is that they just move the arm. They don't move the whole shoulder girdle, and the shoulder girdle refers to 1, 2, 3 bones, and shoulder girdle motion, as opposed to shoulder motion, would look something more like this sliding type thing. So if any of you have heard of retraction, the shoulder blade moving backward, and protraction moving forward, these two portions of the pecs, the middle and the lower pecs, can pull this whole thing forward, but the upper pecs, they just move the arm. So divide these two sort of in your head. Upper pecs just move the arm, middle and lower pecs contribute to moving the entire shoulder girdle. Why? Because they attach from this bone to these non-movable portions, and the upper pec specifically doesn't move this bone, it just sort of brings these two things together like this. Now, in addition to that, again, we need to look at these things now from a different perspective, because what we'll see when we turn the skeleton this way is that these guys, which run a little bit more horizontally into the bone, they stretch and contract more with what? More horizontal motion of the arm, right? If I bring the arm up and out here, just imagine from any position, you can do this with any muscle, if I brought the arm in this position, where would this guy and this guy and this guy pull the arm? These guys would sort of, the upper pecs would pull the arm, as we discussed earlier, straight across this way. The middle pecs may be somewhere in that direction, but the middle and the lower portions, the sort of bottom half of the pecs, they would actually be pulling the arm sort of downward like this. So if you were doing a press out wider and you were just sort of staying upward at this slight incline angle, you would not be at all really targeting the lower pecs, because the lower pecs to a large degree would just be pulling the arm down. Now, do they contribute to some degree to a wider press? Of course, but the only reason they do is because if we turn to this perspective, as I pull the arm backward, these guys are still pulling forward to some direction. But again, if you have a resistance which is sort of more inclined, then that's going to change. So the key thing to remember here is we can't just look at either one or another one of these perspectives. We have to look at both of them to fully understand the pecs. So again, the upper pecs, they just move the upper arm sort of upward toward that clavicle, but the middle and the lower pecs from this perspective will stretch more when the arm is tighter to the body. Why do they stretch more when the arm is tighter to the body? Well, just consider this. How would I move these points of attachment as far away from these points of attachment? What I would have to do is I would have to pull the whole shoulder girdle backward more like this, and I can't do that if my arm is all the way up and out to the side. Why? Because again, of how that fiber direction changes. So really ultimately what we're talking about is how do I take these points as far away from one another as possible, and the way that you do that with the upper pecs is bringing the arm sort of back in this way, and the way that you do that with the middle and the lower pecs is somewhere back tighter to the body, because again, that's that more horizontal motion, and this is in a little bit of a different kind of a plane, which would not recruit these as much, again, in the context of a straightforward press. Now, if you took this to the extreme and you were like, okay, I really want to just isolate for that lower pec, what you would actually need to do is, because again, these fibers run from low to high up into the arm, you would need to load the angle with something more like a dip, right, where now all of a sudden these points are moving as far away from one another as possible, and you would actually allow this whole shoulder girdle to get sort of pulled upward and backward as you're going through a decline press or something similar to that, like a cable decline press or like a dip. And as we discussed earlier, these two portions of the pec, they move the whole shoulder girdle. So you really need to maximize for shoulder girdle motion, which means that as you're coming backward, you're allowing that whole shoulder to sort of shrug upward and backward. And then as you press, you're allowing that shoulder girdle to come forward. A lot of people, what they'll recommend is they'll recommend locking this scapula back into position and not allowing it to move. Not allowing this shoulder blade to move is a great way to take tension off of these fibers and to put tension on the fibers that don't move the shoulder girdle. So in simpler terms, if you're wanting to maximize for stretch and contraction of these guys, you need to allow the arm to come back a little bit tighter to the body, wherever is comfortable for you. For some of you, it might be slightly wider. For some of you, it might be slightly narrower. You also need to maximize for this sliding backward as well as sliding forward on the contraction. If you don't allow this to come forward, you're directly limiting the contraction of these guys. So in summary, a little bit of a wider arm path for the upper pecs. Don't worry too much about moving this shoulder girdle, but don't restrict it. And for the lower and the middle portions of the pec, arm is slightly tighter to the body, and we're really maximizing and allowing for that shoulder girdle motion to occur as we go through those presses. That doesn't mean that you're just slumping all over the place like this, but you keep the spine rigid and you allow all this stuff to move. That's how you're going to maximize for length change and tension in the middle of the lower pecs as compared to the upper ones.
So now that we have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of the differences in how we can recruit the upper versus the lower pecs, let's start to look at some real exercise examples from a variety of angles so that we can really solidify this in terms of our ability to apply this information. So with the upper halves of the pecs, remember and recall that I mentioned that the upper pecs are going to contribute a little bit more to a wider kind of press, so it's a little bit hard to see from this angle, but you can tell that my arm is not tucked in tight to my body. It's slightly wider out to the side, and what you'll also notice in accordance with this upper fiber pec direction is that I'm pressing at a slightly low to a slightly high angle. A lot of people will make the mistake of doing something like an overhead press to try to train the upper pecs, but the upper pecs, again, they run more horizontally than more vertically, and so what that essentially means is that when we do any kind of press like this, where we're bringing our arm sort of across our body in this more horizontal direction, we're going to be targeting more of the upper pecs relative to the lower pecs because of how those fiber orientations change in relationship to the resistance. So for the upper half of the pecs, I highly recommend something like a slightly wider press, something that's still comfortable for you. And then in addition, using an arm path that is slightly low to high to account for the fact that we're trying to bring our arm a little bit higher up on the sternum and more toward the inner border of the clavicle. Now, for the lower half of the pecs, recall that whole conversation that we just had in the anatomy section about the sternoclavicular joint and specifically how much the shoulder girdle motion is important relative to the lower portions of the pec, which again, don't attach to the shoulder girdle, they attach to the sternum and the costal ribs. So when we're optimizing for training the lower half of the pecs, we really need to optimize for moving the shoulder blades altogether, both backward and forward. Remember that whole thing about not restricting scapular motion? Restricting scapular motion is going to be something that directly takes away from our ability to target the lower pecs specifically. And as we're setting up an exercise for the lower half of the pecs, I like to use a slightly high to a slightly low angle. So the differences now here will start to become more clear because what you can see, the relationship between where I'm moving my arms and the resistance here versus where I'm moving my arms and the resistance here is apparently different, right? So again, in the case of targeting more of the upper half of the pecs, a little bit of a wider arm path for that fiber direction and a little bit of a low to high resistance to account for that arm path. But in this second case, I'm using a little bit more of a narrower arm path per stretching and contracting the lower half of the pecs more. And in addition to that, I'm also using a resistance which is angled slightly high to slightly low. And if we sort of imagine imagine, what are the direction of these fibers relative to this resistance? Well, you can see that these fibers here, again, this lower half of the pecs, really sort of the bottom of the sternal pecs, and then the top portions and the lower portions of the lower pecs, those guys, because they're running in this direction, we can draw a straight line here and a straight line here, and you'll see that those fiber directions are parallel. And then again, if we sort of contrast that with this guy, remember that whole anatomy section, we're bringing our arm slightly wider so that our arm is parallel to those fibers, and then we're moving our arm within that same plane and that same direction to account for the fact that that's what will contribute most to training the upper half of the pecs as compared to the lower half of the pecs. Now, we can generalize this and say that wider arm paths tend to target more of the upper half of the pecs, but narrower arm paths tend to target the more lower half of the pecs. But this is not a hard and fast rule, and we need to make sure that we're being precise about the direction of resistance, because if you're using a direction of resistance which is not in accordance with training the pecs, remember to the beginning of this video when I was talking about using resistances that just shove the arm backward, if you're not using a resistance which is shoving the arm backward in some direction, then we're not going to recruit the pecs maximally. So don't forget about the direction of resistance, and here's a good example. If you're doing a motion like this, which is more of an overhead press type of thing, imagine where all these pecs are actually pulling the arm. The lower pecs would be pulling the arm down and inward this way, the middle pecs would be pulling the arm across the body this way, and the upper pecs would also kind of be pulling the arm across this way. If any of the pecs have any degree of leverage in this position, it's the upper pecs, but really what is contributing most to doing this overhead pressing motion is something like the front delt, which sits on the top side of the joint over here in this case, which actually has the capability to pull the arm upward from this position. In addition to the triceps, of course, which would also contribute to a dumbbell press. So remember that even if you have a wider arm path, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be targeting the upper pecs. Or even if you have a narrower arm path, that doesn't mean you're going to be targeting the lower pecs. If you're doing a narrow press, which is kind of more of an incline type of thing, well, you're going to be biasing more of the upper portions of the pec because of the resistance. And likewise, even if you're using a wide arm path, but you're pressing at a really decline angle, like something like a dip or something similar, or a decline bench press, you're going to be biasing much more of the lower pec. So the arm path thing isn't a hard and fast rule, but it always needs to be contextualized to the resistance direction, and that's the main takeaway that I want you all to have from this particular section. So just as important as any of these other variables like muscle architecture and resistance direction and arm path, we need to make sure that whenever we're doing a press or a similar motion like a fly, we need to make sure that we're as stable as possible in relationship to moving the load. Now, we're lucky in that many of the people who have crafted, machines and pieces of equipment for training have understood that, hey, we basically just need to lie down on something to be able to maximize pec recruitment, but this is something that a lot of people don't actually consider as something that needed to be thought through to begin with. So remember that if the resistance direction is pushing our arms back behind our body, imagine if we didn't have a bench behind us, right? It would be silly to even consider that, but remember that the bench is essentially pushing our torso in the opposite direction so that we can just isolate for upper arm motion. And likewise, regardless of whether you're doing a flat press or an incline press, that concept remains the same. So if I'm doing a motion like an incline press here, where the dumbbells are shoving my arms backward and downward behind my body, the bench is effectively keeping my trunk from moving through the bench, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do a press and we wouldn't be able to properly stabilize the torso and the spine so that we could just focus on training the pecs alone. So I mentioned flies just a minute ago, and I want to talk a little bit more about them now, because flies are an incredibly valuable tool, just as valuable as presses, but they do something a little bit different to presses in relationship to training the pecs. So let's talk about that. So in general, flies and fly type motions, specifically when you're using a machine fly, just a regular machine chest fly, flies are more a motion that emphasizes the squeeze position, meaning the position where your arm is more in front of your body. And presses really more so emphasize the stretch. Now, this obviously depends on the implement that you're using, whether it's a machine or dumbbell, it could be slightly different. But overall, it's a generalized appropriate recommendation to say that presses are more for the stretch position where your arm is sort of farther backward, and flies are more for the squeeze or the shortened position where your arm is closer to being in front of your body.
So why are fly type motions going to be more for the squeeze position as compared to presses, which are going to be a little bit more for the stretch position? Well, again, just to go over it very briefly, the stretch position occurs when the arm is back somewhere behind the body this way. But if you're using a dumbbell or a barbell or even most machines, if you press forward, the resistance is doing what? Many of you know that like when you get to the top of a dumbbell press, you can just chill there. There's not really much tension in this position on the pecs. Why? Because the resistance is basically stacked directly over the shoulder and you don't really need to do anything. It's kind of like standing at the top position of a squat and just assuming that that's going to train your quads. It's not. not, right? So when we get to a top of a free weight press and our arm is here, that's not going to do much for us. So why or how can we load the more squeezed position of the muscle? Well, we need a resistance like a fly, which is trying to essentially grab the hand and pull it outward, right? Because if we have a resistance which pulls the arm outward, well, now all of a sudden when I get to this position, instead of a resistance just going straight through my hand this way, it's actually trying to pull my hand outward to the side, okay? And resistances like on cable flies or machine flies that attempt to pull the arm outward from this position keep tension on the pecs, and what you'll notice when you do this is you get a really, really good squeeze toward this position because the resistance is pulling your arm outward. Again, if the resistance is just sort of shoving your arm backward this way, it's not really going to load the pecs very much, if at all, and that's why we need to sort of divide our training between the stretch things. Because again, a dumbbell or something similar is very, very heavy at the bottom because it's very far from the joint. A lot of torque all along the shoulder girdle in this bottom position. But again, as we get toward that stack position, that resistance is going to decrease and we're not going to be able to train that position. But conversely, if I'm doing a fly like a machine fly, I can still continue to squeeze inward against something which is trying to move my arm outward. And that's going to be really effective for targeting these guys. And ideally in your program, you're checking both boxes. So you have something that's more like a free weight press to train that full stretch position, but then you also have something that's training this position in front of your body so that you actually have tension and an ability to resist something in that fully squeezed position. Now, the icing on the cake to understand the differences between all these pecs is really figuring out where these things end up when they're fully contracted, right? Because we went over the fully stretched positions and we can sort of conceptualize, okay, moving these points away, moving these points away, moving these points away. But what happens now when they get to their fully contracted positions? We went over it sort of not in depth before, but now I want to talk a little bit more about how the upper pecs pull the arm across the body upward sort of toward the head this way. The middle pecs pull the arm sort of across the body this way, again, allowing for that shoulder girdle motion. And then the lower pecs do something more like this, where they'll pull the arm sort of down across the body this way. And what you'll notice is that when I bring the arm across the body this way, it is in fact across the body, somewhere sort of across my face. And so what that means is if I'm trying to fully contract the middle pec and I bring my arm all the way across, can you do a double arm motion by bringing the arms fully across? No, they just run into one another. Unless you're going to do one of those crazy exercises where people are crossing like this, right, which I don't think are great options because they're just very unstable with the twisting stuff. What you need to do is you actually need to use a single arm, and you can't even use something like a normal fly machine, because if you're going to use a normal fly machine, your arms get stopped here, right? So a normal fly machine is totally, totally fine, but what you need to remember is the fact that as you're fully shortening any one of the pecs, if I'm going to fully shorten the middle pec, I need to bring my arm across, which necessitates what? Some resistance, which is pulling my arm this way like a cable, or using a fly machine where you're using a single arm. Now, how can we better stabilize these motions? Because again, if I'm using a single arm and I'm not using a bench or something, I need to be able to use other parts of my body to prevent myself from just getting twisted and turned all over the place. So if I'm using my right arm to do a single arm press this way, I need to hold on to something with my left arm. Because if I don't hold on to something with my left arm and I go to push, imagine what the resistance is doing, it's just going to turn me this way. So I need to make sure that if I am going to do a single arm press, that I really make sure that I'm using my opposite side hand and that I'm reaching and I'm holding on to something either in front of me or below me or slightly above me to make sure that, again, I can press without getting twisted all over the place.
One of the things that I just mentioned in that video demonstration is specifically how to fully shorten each of the pecs. You actually need to do it with a single arm where your arm is being brought across your body. So this involves a little bit more of a nuanced perspective of anatomy and a little bit more of a nuanced perspective around stability and how that changes when we do a single arm motion as compared to a double arm motion. So let's talk about it. Well, when I'm doing a single arm press and I'm doing a motion here, which apparently is a little bit more of a high to low press, we're just going to generalize that to say, okay, we're targeting a little bit more of the lower portions of the pec. I need to make sure of a couple of things. The first thing is that I have my same side working leg backward. So what you'll notice is that my right foot in this case is actually behind my left foot, and that's essentially the plant foot, right? That's the foot that basically prevents me from falling backward. But because the single arm motion is going to sort of twist me in a single direction, unlike a double arm press, I need to make sure that I have my opposite side hand anchored on something that I can grab and sort of pull. If you've seen the lat anatomy video that I made a little while ago, what you'll know is that whenever you do a single arm pulling motion, you not only get pulled forward, but you also get sort of twisted by the resistance. So in any case, case, if you're doing a single arm press like this, or you're doing a single arm press like this, which would now be more, again, according to the arm path and the resistance direction of this motion, you need to make sure that that plant foot is behind you. Again, that same side foot in this case, the right foot and the right arm are working together. And then the opposite side hand in my left hand is preventing me from getting turned. And what you can see, again, in this scenario is I'm bringing my arm all the way across my body, and I'm making sure that that cable is pulling slightly outward so that I can actually load that squeeze position, unlike a traditional press, or unlike even a fly machine, where if I'm using both hands, my hands get sort of stopped in that fully squeezed position where I can't bring my arm fully across my body. So the squeeze position stuff, again, per our discussion in the functional anatomy section, really allows you to be more specific with which of the pecs that you're training, which is something that you can't really do in a normal press where you're emphasizing the stretch position. So that's kind of part and parcel of the benefit of both of these things, which is that if you're doing a motion like this, you can make it more specific to one or multiple of the pecs. But if you're doing a more press type motion where you're emphasizing the stretch, all those pecs will contribute more together. So neither of these options is necessarily better or worse, and which you choose will depend on what your specific goals are within the context of a single session or a single week. My piece of advice to you would be, if you're trying to be more specific about a pec, you want to kind of start with one of these more single arm motions or one of those fly motions where you're ending up at a more specific point in front of the body. And if you're trying to just blast all your pecs together with every exercise that you can, because training your whole chest is a specific goal of yours, then there's nothing wrong with that, and that's perfectly fine as well. Now, let's talk about some practical recommendations insofar as applying this stuff to a program goes. The first thing that I'll say, again, is that if your goal is to target all the pecs, grow as much of your chest as possible, I would recommend roughly a 50-50 volume split between training the lower pecs and training the upper pecs. Remember that all the pecs do function slightly differently, and so in accordance with my recommendation about dividing the chest into sort of lower and upper halves, it makes a little bit more sense to me to divide motions into lower half and upper half. And again, if you're doing 10 or 15 sets in a week, you can say, okay, I'm going to maybe divide 5 sets to the lower pecs and then 5 sets to the upper pecs. Or if you have a bias and you want to split it up a little bit less evenly because maybe you want to grow your upper pecs a little bit more, or maybe you want to grow your lower pecs a little bit more, consider more of a 60-40 split or a 70-30 split, where maybe if you're doing 10 total sets and you want to train your upper pecs more, maybe do 6 or 7 of those sets for the upper half of the pecs, and the remaining 3 to 4 for the lower half of the pecs. In addition, I would say the majority of your volume is likely to be most benefited by doing presses, specifically because presses will really give you a full pec blast. But again, the nuances of how you do the press, and specifically how you choose your arm path, how you choose the resistance direction relative to the arm path, will ultimately be the things that dictate the outcome of any single pressing exercise. So hopefully this was helpful. If you liked it, please subscribe, please share the video, and definitely leave any comments if any of you have any questions. I'm happy to get to any and all of them as fast as I can.